Hi again and welcome to the chapter Attacking Methods 1. I know that this is a course about defensive play, but I thought it would be interesting for a moment to put ourselves in the attacker's shoes, to look at things from the opposite angle, so to speak. Attacking methods, of course, that's a big area, so I have split this material into two chapters. In this chapter, chapter 18, we will have a look at three key methods of attacking play. These are mobilization to the attack, when we bring the pieces to the attack. We will look at aggressive exchanges when we're trading off the opponent's defending pieces. And we will also have a look at how we can open up lines for our attack, such as files for our rooks and diagonals for our bishops and so on. While in the other chapter, in chapter 19, the next chapter, we will check some other ideas that we will come to in that chapter. So let's start with mobilization. I'm talking about the simple idea of bringing our pieces closer to the battlefield. This is something that both the attacking and the defending side can do. Obviously, mobilization, it applies to both sides. Basically, we try to increase the number of attacking forces on the battlefield so that we can outnumber our opponent. Let's have a look at our first example. I wanted to show you a few different cases, one for each piece, so to speak. I won't tell you still which pieces are involved, but that's how I have organized this material. In the first example here, we will see how black managed to bring a piece to the attack in a very powerful way, which basically decided the game. We have with white pieces knight, and playing black is no one less than fantastic attacking player Alexei Shirov. This, I think it's a reversed Sicilian Rossolimo, yeah, something like that. Knight played, I think, the English, and they ended up in some kind of reversed Rossolimo. Shirov traded later, earlier on, on c3, bishop takes c3, that was a long time ago, and now he's playing for an attack. You can see that white's king is rather exposed in this position because the light squares are weak. The bishop has left the fianchetto position, the bishop on h3, it would have been better off probably on g2, even if this would have meant in that case that black would trade off that bishop. That's the second idea that we will talk about, aggressive exchanges. In any case, this is how the position looks, and you can see that black would really like to play for an attack. We always try to attack the opponent at their weakest spot, and safe to say, leaving aside the weakness of the c4 pawn, which can also be attacked, of course, we are basically speaking about white's king here. So what do you think? If you let one of your pieces pick a square, any square that you would like on the board, which piece would you use and where would you put it? If you ask yourself that question, you will easily understand here Shirov's next move. Of course, when we dominate the open file in this way, we just love to install a battery, queen and bishop, preferably with the queen first, of course, so that we can threaten mate. And that's where Shirov took the game with his next move here. Very clever move, queen f7. So if you look careful here, you can see that we're targeting the pawn on c4, but that's just, you could say, in the background. That's not really important here. What black is trying to do is to bring the queen to the long diagonal. They would like to play queen h5 and queen f3. But not only that, you have other, what can you say, merits of this move. You also have the fact that you might be able to play something like knight e4. You can target the pawn on f2 also. White has a big challenge here to defend this position. You could say that, for example, the knight on e2, it's not well placed here. It's not helping in any real way white's defensive task. So very difficult position. It's almost impossible to save white here. By the way, you could, of course, also play the move bishop f3. Maybe you thought about this. It's a very natural move. But still, I would say it somehow hurts a little our flexibility, because that's probably the square that we would like to pick up. We would use that square, with a queen. So we have this move in the pocket, bishop f3. Maybe we don't need to commit it right now. We can do it later. So queen f7, that's what Shirov played. Let's see very quickly what happened here. White played queen b6. They're going for a counterattack. If white tries to trade off the bishop with bishop g2, black can then switch their focus. We will talk about that a little later, I think, in the next chapter, about when we're attacking. We attack different weak spots in the opponent's camp, and we can toggle between these weak spots. So in this case, after bishop g2, we will take on g2, bishop takes, king takes, and here I think knight g4 is very powerful, because you can see that not only are we targeting the pawn on f2, we also have queen f3 coming up. So this would be a complete nightmare for white. So after queen f7, knight went for a counterattack, queen b6, creating some pressure along the d-file, but Shirov just sticks to his plan here, queen h5, hitting the bishop on h3. We're also hitting the knight on e2, as you can see. Too many threats for white. Bishop e6 check, king h8, and here knight h went for a counterattack, but it's very, very difficult to defend his position. You can see that there are several, you could say, targets in white's camp. White played here bishop takes c5, and you can play in different ways, but the most simple one is what Shirov did in the game. He just continues with the plan, queen f3. So right now, as you can see, there is the threat of mating 1. We don't care too much about what else happens on the board. That's typical for attacking play. You focus on your side, so to speak. If you remember in the previous chapter, we saw this very nice example, Lauritsen versus Chakraborty. If you remember that black went all in on the king side, and their queen side was completely in ruins. So, I mean, even if it was not fully correct that time, it's the right mindset when you're attacking. You don't care too much about losing the c5 pawn, for example, or a hanging knight on d6. You just want to attack. All right, white played at this point bishop d5, trying to obstruct black's bishop. And at this point, Shirov changed plan a little. He took on d5, knight takes d5, and after c takes d5, what do you think black played next? Did I take the pawn, or did I play something else? You could probably take the pawn also. It should probably also win the game, but maybe white gets a chance to, I don't know, some counter attack or something. Well, not really, no. That will also win the game, definitely. But I like his move. I think it's much nicer, it's much cleaner. You got it. He played bishop d7. Very pretty move. The bishop is coming to h3. No way white can really prevent the mate coming up on g2. A classical mate, you could say, the mate on g2, g7. It's very common. So nice and simple example. We can quickly bring in the queen. That's the most powerful attacking piece, of course. Queen f7, queen h5, queen f3. That's a very nice plan. All right, let's check another piece. This was the queen. I won't tell you yet which is the next piece that we will use. You can look at this position here. We're playing with the white pieces, a French structure. White has managed to keep black's king in the center. Right now the king is on f8. If you remove the queens, from the board, probably black would be a little better here. Long term, the structure is fine, or at least equal with the bishop pair and so on. Although it's true that the bishop on d7 is not that strong. But in any case, what I'm trying to say here is that the presence of queens makes a huge difference on this position. Such positions are often fine when queens are off for black, I mean, but this is a bit complex for them because the queens are on and the king is in the middle, so not easy for black. Anyway, we have to find a good way to continue our plan here in this game between with the white pieces Rachmanidis and playing black Schroeder. So what do you think? We would like to bring in the pieces to the king side, right? We would like to play something like rook g3, but then obviously we're losing the pawn on e5. We could take on h6, but probably their king can go that way and it wouldn't be that clear. So what else could we do here? We could start with rook ae1. That would be a typical move. Bring all the pieces to the action. We are covering this square so as to go rook g3 next turn, but after king e7, maybe black would get a chance to play, I don't know, rook here maybe and try to keep the king on this side, or in the best of dreams, bring the king to the other side. So there is actually a better plan for white. And if you consider this possible idea, black's idea of sneaking away to the queen side with the king, well, in that case, you will be a bit closer to the solution, because what Rachmanidis did here, he noticed that one of his pieces is not doing anything at this moment, and it can be introduced into the attack in a very powerful way. It starts with a retreating move. Aha, I'm convinced that you know which is the right move by now. Of course, he played here the very pretty move, bishop c1. So what's going on here is that there is no opposing bishop on the a3 f8 diagonal, which means that white's bishop will enter. And not only that, black king will probably go that way, and this means that we can improve the bishop further, and we can do something like this, bishop e7, bishop f6, in order to trade off black's most important defensive piece, the bishop on g7. So that's what white played in this game. Black had a difficult choice here, how to continue, what to do about this invasion of the white bishop. In the game they played rook h7. You could say the good thing about this move is that it provides the king with some more protection. The bad thing is that once white shifts their focus to the whole board, so to speak, that rook will be terribly offside. You'll see what I mean once we see a little more of the game. The best choice would have been here, it seems, queen c7 instead. Of course, this is not so intuitive because after bishop a3 check, king g8, white would get here bishop d6 with tempo. Still, I think this was the least of evils. Queen d8, rook g3. Now white can play this since the bishop is protecting the pawn. However, after queen e8, a very slow move, but you can see we need to protect this pawn. Next step would be king h7, rook g8, and who knows, maybe black can save this. I'm pessimistic, honestly, because white can bring in more pieces, like the knight could come here, or maybe at some point we could open the game. That's opening up lines. We will look at that a little later in this chapter. But okay, objectively speaking, this would have been the best choice perhaps for black. In the game, they play this move rook h7, which means that the rook is offside now. Let's see what happened. Bishop a3 check, the king went that way, king g8, and we continue with our plan, of course, bishop e7. Black played rook e8, and after bishop f6, you can see that black sooner or later will have to accept the trade of their defender on g7, because else there are big problems coming up on the g file. So black played at this point f4, trying to cook up some counterplay, deny white of this square. White simply played rook f3, and after bishop takes f6, e takes f6, e5. Black was trying to take over, but unfortunately, simple common sense suggests that you cannot really get away with this. You can't play with a rook less. That's now, it's not so much about the weakness of black's king anymore. This is more about the fact that black has a rook off the battle. You can't do that in the long run. Your opponent will start trading off your other pieces, and you will end up with that problem piece. So that's exactly what happened here in the game. White played knight f5. Of course, it was difficult to find a better destiny for the knight. It has to go there. But I'm just saying that white is happy to trade off that knight, because the more pieces leave the board, the better, as long as black keeps this bad rook on h7. So knight f5, bishop takes, queen takes. Black has a pawn center, you could say, but it's more of a weakness than a strength here, because it's difficult to maintain it. Rook e6 followed in the game, and rook d1. You can see that white starts putting pressure on these pawns. They are now probably planning rook fd3, and you can even visualize some kind of back rank motives. b6 was played in the game. It's difficult to give black good advice here. Rook fd3, and black played d4. Black's hope here is that somehow the position will close. They will cook up some counterplay, like if c takes d4, they would like to go e4. Yeah, that's what I thought at least, but the computer of course said that queen takes f4 wins. Because we have queen b8 coming up next. So that was also possible. In the game, white played in very simple fashion. f3 first, so as to prevent e4. Black is basically without any hope here. It's a hopeless position for them. No good plans available, and it's like a time bomb here. White will sooner or later invade along the d file. They played in the game h5 to improve this rook on h7, but it's little too late. c takes d4, rook h6, d takes e5. Black resigned in this hopeless position. So very nice display here by Rachmanidis. He noticed that he had this, you would even say perhaps bad bishop. I don't know if that's the correct term. Probably not, because the bishop is still rather active on this side. But still, it was not completely, what can you say, expected that the bishop would become such a giant in this way. But that's what he did. Important to look at the whole board. That's a beautiful maneuver to help white's attack, bringing the bishop to the main battlefield, you could say, the king side. All right, let's see another example. We will look at another piece. So by now you know it's not about the queen, and it's also not about the bishop. So only two options left. You will have to guess, but this one is very simple, you could say. We're playing with the white pieces, a typical Italian structure, I think. White gave up a pawn on d4, but black got this pawn at the price of pushing the g-pawn, which is always dangerous, of course, in this structure, because that's where the king is. You can see this plan very often in contemporary play. Black plays h6, g5 in the Italian, but very often they keep the king on e8, and sometimes it can even go to the queen side. But here the king is already on g7 in this game between with white pieces Jordan van Forest and playing black Peter Leko. So really high level battle. In this game, Van Forest continued with his attack. Which piece would you like to bring to the attack? yeah, not very difficult. This is the standard plan within the Italian and in the Ruy Lopez structures. You got it. He played here the move knight f1. Please notice that you could give check on f5, but it's slightly more flexible to keep this in the pocket, because if you do it now, they evidently take, and in this case, we don't have this stronghold for our knights anymore. So we can maybe do that later. We can keep it in the pocket. So knight f1, that's the simple move played here by Van Foreest. You can see that black's already a pawn up. If they take a second pawn, it will be extremely dangerous, because white's pieces will start approaching the king side. Rook b1 could be played first. I think it was Ivan Sokolov who analyzed this position. Bishop c3, rook e3, bishop b4, rook d3. I'm following Sokolov's analysis, bishop c5 and knight e3. White has a perfect mobilization of forces. You can see that black is outnumbered on the king side. Knight f5 is coming next. If black takes on e3, well, in that case, they are definitely missing the Darsgaard bishop. We can perhaps bring our queen a little later to the action also, something like that, or I don't know. Many ideas come to mind here. It's difficult to play black in this position. Who knows, maybe at some point even some pawn break like e5. So in the game, after the simple move knight f1, black played instead here bishop f6. The point of this move is to force white to move the knight before the other knights. Before the knights, are able to settle on f5. So bishop f6 makes perfect sense. Van Foreest hurried to play knight f5 to save that knight. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Now you would say, but okay, what happened to my knight? I can't reach f5 anymore. Don't worry. If you have some patience, you will see that perhaps the knight will end up there in the end. And also we can do other things with the knight. You can see that also there is another route to the king side in this way. So in the first place here, the queen is attacking the pawn on g4, so black played h5. And here, again, we're talking about this knight. We would like to bring it to the attack. We will need a little help from another piece. What do you think Van Foreest played? A simple but very strong move, bishop f4, because we want to put the knight on g3, attacking the pawn on h5. At this point, Leko played bishop g5, a perfectly reasonable move to trade pieces and try to bring the knight to f6 perhaps at some point. I think Sokolov also looked at this move, knight e5. I just wanted to mention that very briefly, that in this case, knight e5, bishop b3. If we include these moves with black after bishop g5, Sokolov noticed a very nice move here. Can you see it? It's a second sacrifice. Very, very unexpected move, f6, very pretty. What's going on? Well, we're creating some kind of chaos in black's position. We would like to play knight g3, but only when black takes on f6. So if they take with the queen here, for example, we could play this pretty move, knight g3, and no matter what happens, this pawn is in the air. And also we have some other tricks like knight e4 and things like that. So that could have happened in the event of knight e5. In the game, black played bishop g5, trying to trade pieces. You can guess our next move. You got it. We will use exactly the same trick. Knight g3, clever move by Van Foreest. We can see this typical knight maneuver now. Improving white's attack. If bishop takes e4, this is a simple trick that Van Foreest had prepared. He will take back on f4 with a very nice position. So knight g3, black played king h6. Interesting defensive play by Petr Leko. Great defender. You can see that it's not a usual place for the king, but in this way, black at least secures the pawn on h5. So the next move, I would say, is the most difficult in this example. We sometimes say that two things are difficult for humans. One of them is to give up material, and the other one is to retreat our pieces. Here, Van Foreest did the latter. He retreated one piece. Which piece and why? That's a tricky part, but he actually played here the move bishop c1. That's a great move. I guess the point of this move is simply that we want black to take on c1 instead. We don't want to take ourselves on g5. We could have done that, but in that case, black is happy to bring in the queen. So we prefer them to carry out the trade. You can also see that if you played something like queen d2, I think black would do the same thing. Take, and of course, after queen g5, they would be extremely happy if they could trade off the queens. So nice move by Van Foreest, bishop c1. A funny move going back for the bishop to c1, but it helps white's development. So bishop takes, and now we take with the rook. We have one more piece in the action. If black plays queen g5, this time it's not so fortunate, because we can then attack it with knight e4. We don't care about that pawn. We talked about that before. Don't be too materialistic when attacking. Just try to find good prospects for your pieces. Queen takes f5, bishop d3. It's also very nice for white. You can see that black's king is definitely starting to feel a little uneasy there, we can again resort to this plan in the near future, and also the queen might join the party here at some point. So rook takes e1, knight e5 was playing in the game, bishop a2, the sniper bishop here on this diagonal. Black played knight f6, they defended in the very best way. A nice duo of defending knights. However, white is still better here. It's time to bring in the queen, just like Shirov did. Now Van Foreest uses a similar idea. You got it, queen d2 check, and after king h7, of course, that queen quickly joins the battle from g5, which means that the pawn on h5 is again in danger. Black played rook g8, and after queen h4, it seems that here it was the last chance really to defend in a good way, but with the black pieces. Ivan Sokolov suggests here the move rook g7, so that the king can sneak away to g8. This would be a better defensive setup. But he explains himself that white should not take on h5 at this point because of the knight takes, queen takes, king takes. Black would be rather safe here. I think even there is the threat of rook h7 trapping the queen perhaps. He says that white should play the move bishop b3. Bishop b3, but why on earth should I make a move like that? What's the point? Well, if you look carefully, you will see that white is actually preparing an exchange sacrifice. They know that black is tied up here. The knight is tied up to the pawn, the queen is tied up to the knight. So what black is doing here, white is preparing to take on e5 and then play rook d1. That's why the bishop goes there. So Ivan's variation continues, king g8, and now rook takes, pawn takes, rook d1, queen e7 I was going to say, but if queen e7 probably it's game over after knight takes h5, right? I think so, yeah, knight takes h5, and the knight does not have any good square, right? As far as I can see, knight e5. f6, for example. Yeah, that's definitely not good for black. So rook d1, knight e7, and the queen takes h5, and black is in big trouble here. You can see that the knight can come here, and maybe we have some move like f6 coming up also. So very dangerous for black. Something about, by the way, the relative value of the pieces. Here, you would say material is favoring black. They have a clear exchange. But white's way more active. All their pieces are in very nice places. We cannot say that this rook on a8 is worth 5 points. It's not correct to say that, right? While white's rook on d1, that's probably, 6 points at least, you could say. It's a very active rook. It has an open file. So anyway, that's what could have happened in the game. After queen h4, they played knight ft7, trying to trade queens. Of course, no. We take on h5, queen takes h5, king g7. And as I told you a while ago, that knight really wants to come to f5, so you can guess white's next move. Of course, that's what Van Foreest played, very nice, f6, so as to bring the knight to f5. So in the end, after queen takes f6, we are actually ready to bring the knight to f5. Van Foreest waited a little, flexibility thinking. He played first rook takes c7. Now you can see also the rook is in the battle. And by the way, if they take with a knight on f6, hitting our queen, then we will definitely play knight f5, and we will have concluded our nice knight maneuver to the attack, king f8, and white will have a fantastic attack here. This is what Ivan Sokolov, I think, analyzed. King e8 and rook takes c7. Yeah, it's raining tactics here. Everywhere there are some kind of tactics. Rook takes, it looks like some Mikhail Tal game. Queen takes c7, queen takes f6. That's a poor king in the stack in the middle. Yeah, white is going to win this game very soon. All right, back to the game. Queen takes f6, rook takes c7. Now we're heading towards somewhat calmer waters. You can see that black might be able to trade queen somehow, but white's having a lot of activity here. And don't forget about the sniper bishop. It's very strong on a2. King f8, rook takes b7. White is very practical. Let's pick up a pawn. And black played here queen g6 in order to trade queens. And I like the decision that Van Foreest took here. You would say, okay, don't trade queens, we're attacking. But he noticed that the position has changed. He's actually pawn up now. Black's pawn structure is not ideal. The pawn on d6 is weak. So once you feel that you're actually in the driver's seat, it actually makes sense to trade queens also. You don't need to attack forever, no? So he played here the nice move queen f5, trading on R terms. That's what he played here. So after queen takes e5, black was perhaps not forced to take, but there are some tactical issues on this side also. Or maybe white will just take and put the knight on f5 anyway. Queen takes, knight takes. Black had to protect his pawn with rook g6. Van Foreest played b4, and later on he went on to convert his extra pawn into victory. So This part I wanted to show also when you're playing for an attack, don't expect to always finish with mate or winning the queen or something like that. Sometimes the best outcome from an attack might be a better endgame, like in this case. White has a very nice endgame. You can see that the bishop remains a key player here, not to speak of the fantastic knight on f5. So nice example, long example, but I think it was useful to go through this key moment in this game. Already at this point, White played knight f1, simply bringing the knight in, but we should not forget about the little trick that Van Foreest later used with bishop f4 and knight g3. I mean, that was really important so that the knight could continue its journey towards the black king side. I mean, after bishop f6, knight f5, check, bishop takes, pawn takes, h5. This move I'm talking about, bishop f4. Very, very important. We understand that we should bring in the knight also to improve the attack at black's king, which remains a weakness here. All right, let's continue. So there is only one piece left, right? Now you know, of course, which piece is left, but you would figure that out even without my hint. In this example, with the white piece is Dubov and playing black is Ilyushinok. I think this is the Petrov. From what I can see, something tells me that it's, well, some kind of king pawn opening in any case. So actually white is already much better here. They have an extra pawn and they have a more active position, so they must be better. But I like the way in which Dubov focused on the black king and managed to finish off this game rather quickly. So you can see that there are not many defenders on black's king side. Also, you can notice that we have opposite color bishops, which very often helps the side which is attacking, because the defending side has difficulties defending on the color, the squares of the color which they don't control, like in this case the dark square. So black is very happy, of course, to have this pawn on g7, and you can imagine that this is going to be a target for white's attack. So having said that, which piece would you like to bring to the attack and how to achieve it with white pieces? Aha, you got it. The least active piece here, of course, that's one way to figure out this also. The least active piece is the rook on b1. We should bring it to the king side. This is not the right route because the bishop is there, so Dubov simply played rook e1. As simple as that, bringing the rook to the attack. Ilyushinok played at this point c5. We could play rook d6, but first there was a little trick here. Dubov played rook d3, threatening to go rook g3 and bishop h6 so as to provoke g6. That would be a huge achievement for white. Then this square on f6 would become a target also for the bishop, for example. It would like to settle on that square. So black played here bishop f5. Now, since the bishop is ready to block the rook on the g file, sorry, Dubov went back to the original plan. First he plays rook d6, after rook e6, now he continues with the rook transfer. This is nice because whenever black takes on d6, we take with the pawn, and we have, yeah, you can see that we have a very nice passed pawn on top of it. So this will be a complete nightmare for black. Rook e3, they played rook a e8, and Dubov continues with his plan here. Rook g3, after queen h5. We would like to bring in the bishop at some point, but the pawn is a little shaky on e5, so first we play here the move rook g5, tying up black. They now have to play queen h7 so as to secure this bishop. All right, so far we have managed to improve our pieces in a very nice way. You can see that the rook was on b1, and now it has found a way to g5. So sometimes, in order to find the best move in attacking positions, also in general in chess, when you have a better position, especially when you feel that all your pieces are in good places, I'm talking about queens, knights, rooks, and bishops, you feel that they're already in very good places, very often that's a signal that we should try to find some pawn move. Some pawn move that might be the way in which we can improve our position. And that happened here. Which pawn move would you recommend for white at this point? That's completely right. We can use our extra pawn in order to soften up black's king side. h4, that's the move Dubov played here. Very simple, very strong. This pawn will loom forward. Sooner or later, black will have to do something about their g-pawn. Also, any attempt to block white's rook, we can now consider at some point to kick the bishop away with h5. So black played in the game, rook takes d6. In the end, they had to do this. White took back, e takes. Now there is the threat of d7 at some point. Black played bishop d7 and bishop e5. Very nice. What we're doing here, we're kindly asking black to move the g-pawn, which will help our attack even further. Yeah, g6 would be terrible, h5, and you can imagine that one way or another white will break through here. This is just one idea, queen f4, queen f6, or maybe reroute the rook to to the h file in some way. Could be possible also, but this would be the simplest choice, I think. Or perhaps also we could target with queen d3, we could target the pawn on g6. Anyway, bishop e5, black played queen takes h4. They're saying, all right, you can have the pawn on g7. Interestingly, I think most of us, myself included, would consider to take this pawn right now. Bishop takes and rook takes. But look what Dubov did. He actually played bishop f6. That's very pretty, because there is no rush, really. You can't go g6 anyway, because we'll take and the queen falls off, right? So, nice move. Bishop f6. Black's queen now has to leave the king side. So black played here queen e4, and now Dubov took on g7. After king f8, I'm convinced that you can see the last move in the game. It's not very difficult. You got it. We're bringing the queen a little closer to the action. Queen h6. That is the immediate threat of queen h8, and yeah, other threats also. Rook check first and so on. So black resigned at this point. The check on e1 won't have any big effect after king h2. So nice example, I think. Simple but very nice. Try to bring in the rook into the attack. We would very often use some kind of rook cliff like that, but it was not possible due to black's bishop, so we will go this way instead, and we will bring the rook that way. Rook e3, rook g3. And once the rook is there, we already have like a numeric advantage, you could say. We have more attacking piece in that black has defenders, and don't forget the little h-pawn, which is happy to join the battle at some point. All right, so far we have seen the idea of mobilization to the attack. Now I would like to switch subject and talk about the second idea that we were going to cover in this chapter, and that was defensive exchanges, I was going to say, but it's actually the opposite. It's the aggressive exchanges, when we try to trade off the opponent's defending pieces. There is always at least one piece which is important in their defense, and we could try to swap it off. That's what happened here in our next game. We have with the white pieces Aryan and playing black Rahman. You can see that this is some kind of King's Indian attack structure. You can easily see that from the kingside fianchetto and the fact that white's h-pawn is already on h6. This is a very nice opening. It has been used, I think it's still used quite often. I remember that Bobby Fischer was one of the first players who used this beautiful game. Some of you maybe you know the game where he played queen takes h7 against Mjachmar Suren a long time ago. He sacked the queen and he mated on the h-file. There is also a nice game against Oscar Pano where Fischer goes for an endgame, and even there in the endgame he finds some nice dynamics. I think that was a fantastic move, bishop e4. Yeah, those are really classical games in the King's Indian attack. Anyway, let's have a look at this position. Let's see what it's about. You can see that this h-pawn, it really helps our attack. Fischer was one of the first players to understand that. Nowadays it's evidently part of opening theory. In many openings we push the pawn to h6. It will help enhance our attack in many situations, not only for the mate on g7 with the queen, but also due to back rank motives that emerge in this case. So what do you think? How could we progress in this attack? Which are the obstacles right now? If you look carefully, you can see that there is one black piece which is very important in their defense. Since they have so many pawns on light squares, it's easy to figure out which that piece would be, right? You got it, of course. We have the defending bishop on e7. We would really like to trade off this great bishop on e7, and that's what Aryan did with his next move here. He played simply, of course, you got it, knight f3. We're hitting the bishop on d3, which means that we win a tempo here. Black played bishop c4, and we continue with our plan, bishop g5. Black can't really avoid this trade, which means that if these bishops leave the board, well, for starters, white will have this very important attacking idea, queen f3, queen f6, and queen g7. So evidently black won't allow that. They played in the game, Rahman played queen b7 instead, trading on my turn, so to speak, to take back with a queen on e7. White is not in a hurry to trade. He played here first queen d2. Typical maneuver in the King's Indian attack. The queen would like to go to f4. Black played knight c6. They're starting to bring their pieces to the defense. Queen f4. Now black took on g5, and after knight takes g5, they played here queen e7. This is not only a way to prevent queen f6, it's also preparing, I think, a little tactical trick. Can you see what black has in mind here? If it was black to move, what would they play? You're completely right. There is some kind of overloaded piece here. The queen is defending here and is also defending there. So black would like to take on d4. We should not forget about these small tactical details. We shouldn't over-focus on the opponent's king. We have to look a little at possible dangers in our camp also. So here Aryan played simply rook d1. difficult situation for black already. It's hard to come up with a plan, but it's interesting also to talk about white's plan here. So how do you think that white would improve here? How would they continue with their attack? They don't really want to play queen f6 because that's something we have in the pocket. If we play it here, they will take and they can attack that pawn, right, with knight e7. We don't really like that picture. So how could white improve their attack? Well, if you look carefully, you will see that there is one white piece which is not doing anything. And I'm talking about the King's Indian bishop. This bishop, it has an interesting destiny here. We won't use it to attack like in that famous Fischer-Pano game where he played bishop e4. We will use it to trade off black's bishop. Why would we do that, you would say? Why? What does this bishop has to do with everything here? But the fact is that white, in order to break through here, they need like some extra, what can I say, some extra target in the position. So what they would like to do, either they want to trade off the bishops so that a knight can attack this pawn and hopefully go to d6 one day. If black, for example, defends the pawn with the rook, well, then the rook is not completely functional, you could say. Maybe white could try to play on the c file, for example. On the other hand, if we manage to trade off the bishops, that also means that our rook will have a nice path similar to Dubov's rook maneuver, right? We would love to put the rook on f3 to put pressure on the pawn on f7. So that's what white has in mind here. In the game, black played b4, looking for some counterplay. But if black had played something more cautious, something like knight e7, for example, improving the knight and controlling the f6 square, well, white could have resorted to this idea that I'm talking about, bishop f1. That's the kind of move which somehow, like the last straw, you would say in English, like it puts some additional pressure on the opponent, and in the end, they won't be able to cope with all the threats. So difficulties for black. If bishop takes, you can see what I mean. We take with the king so that the rook is still protecting the pawn. This pawn is now in the air. We would love to put the knight on d6. And if they play something like rook b8, we could play perhaps rook d3 and continue with this devilish plan of attacking the pawn. Or maybe at some point we could also consider rook c1, although in that case you would have to make sure that knight takes d4 is not the problem. But yeah, I would go for this plan in the first place. So that's important to understand. I don't know if we should call this a defense, an aggressive trade. I'm not sure, because this bishop is not really a defending piece, you would say. But in a way, it's defending also. But it's something about looking at the whole board. You have already like big pressure on the king side. You have them really tied up on the king side, but you need to do something more. And that's why we should look at the queen side. And in that sense, you could in fact say that the bishop is a defender. So maybe in that way, you could say this is actually an aggressive exchange. Yeah, never mind the labels. The important thing is to understand the move. So rook d1 was played in the game. Black played b4. And in the game, I think white took on a4, and the game got very complex. Bishop b3, knight b6, rook b8, rook d3. You know where that rook is going, of course. But bishop c2 was played by black, and they were, I think, preparing bishop f5. Things got a little out of hand here. Also, the knight is hanging. There was a much simpler path to go here. b4. We can take on b4. They have to take with a knight, of course, else our queen will enter. And here you could resort to our favorite plan here, bishop f1, as we talked about. This would have been very difficult for black. White is perhaps not winning, but it's a very serious advantage. Let's say, for example, bishop takes. We take with the king as usual, and they have this pawn also now to think about. If they defend it, I'm sure you can find white's next move here, right? Sorry, of course, time is right to move a piece that we haven't moved so far in this example. You got it, knight b5, heading for the strong square on d6. So this would have been very difficult for black. You can see that trading the bishops didn't win the game for white, but it definitely improved our chances, and black is really tied up at this point on the king side. And don't forget about this little pawn, please. It's extremely helpful in many attacks. All right, we will continue, and let's look at the same idea, but in a completely different situation, because if this was a closed middle game, long game, we have to play on the whole board, we have to go step by step. Just look at our next example. We have with white pieces Gareev and playing black is Posthuma. You can see that this is something completely different. White is right now 2 pawns down, but just look at the activity of the pieces, and it's a funny feature here. There is a piece which usually doesn't show up in that place. You know what I talk about. It looks almost like Fischer random, this queen on g8. What on earth is she doing there? Well, probably she was on g7 and she had to go down to g8, I guess. So that's the position that we have here. It's funny in my eyes, this position. Does not look like a normal game. Anyway, we need to win this game with white. We should try to figure out which is the best course of action. All our pieces are rather well placed, I would say. We have a harmonious position. We cannot say the same thing about black. They almost don't have a single good piece here. The only good thing about their position is that they have 2 extra pawns. But anyway, how to attack black's king? How could we possibly get at black's king in this position? Please notice that Gareev has no thoughts on taking on h8. That would make a huge favor to black. Queen takes h8. Suddenly the queen is a really nice piece in this position. You can see that the queen, it could maybe go here, the bishop goes there, the king could go this way, and we lost our tremendous bishop on b2. That would be completely wrong. Please notice here the difference in relative activity, you could say relative value, sorry, of the pieces. So this bishop, it's not 3 points, it's at least 4 points. What about this rook? Well, it's up to you, but I wouldn't give it more than 3 points maybe, we can say that. So it's not a good business for white to trade there. This one is worth more than that for sure. 4-3, yeah. Anyway, leaving numbers aside, we understand that we should not do that, of course. We're just helping black's development. It will take ages for them to develop the rook on h8 anyway. So, what does this example have to do with aggressive exchanges, with swapping off the defender? What do you think? Which piece would you like to trade here from black's pieces? Which do you think is the most important defender? You might say the bishop on f8, and I agree, this is also an important defender, but it's not easy to defend it right now. To trade it right now. It's not easy at all. But there is another way in which we can get at black's king. I mean, this is a typical channel to attack, but right now it's defended. But there is another part of the board. If you look at the whole board, you will notice, it turns out that actually the A file is open, and black's pieces on g8 and h8, they are far away from the action. So what Gareev did here is not exactly difficult. He used simple common sense in this case, and he said, all right, black is weak on the queen side, that's where I should attack. And he played here rook a1, trying to trade off the rook on a8 so that the queen can enter. So if black takes, this would be disastrous, of course. We're hitting the rook, and at the same time the queen gets ready to invade. So Posthuma played after rook a1, rook b8 instead. Sorry, rook a1, rook b8, trying to defend the queen side as best as possible. Rook a7 was of course possible, but in the game, Gareev continues in a more flexible fashion, you could say. He starts with queen e2, so that the bishop is tied up to the pawn. They cannot play bishop g7. Black played here h6 to prevent knight g5, I think, but we have another destiny for the knight. Knight f4 was played. A very nice move. I know the computer wanted to play rook a7, but I like Gareev's move more because this is a piece that was not doing too much. And if we bring more pieces to the battle, simple logics dictate that that must be good for us, while black cannot do the same thing. Black played here king d8. I think they were already scared of some sacrifice somewhere. I'm just trying to figure out how. Actually, it's not easy to see sacrifice, but maybe white, they don't need it. They are ready to continue the invasion now, but they just wanted to have some, like bishop takes and pawn takes and knight e6, some idea like that, some feature like that. Or maybe you could imagine something like bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and in the end, knight takes g6. Something like that. White is toying with these ideas, and you could say in a psychological perspective, you're even like scaring black a little to make them make some choice. We don't know ourselves what we will do, but we know that they will be a little scared. So black played here king d8, perfectly logical, moving away the king from the king side so that these sacrifices won't be that dangerous, and at the same time the king would like to help in the defense on the queen side. But at this point, what Gareev did, he actually sacrificed anyway. Bishop takes d6, so this is a very inventive player, by the way. Gareev has always very interesting games, and I think what he noticed here was simply that once he installs that knight on e6, it's going to be a giant. No? Bishop takes d6, f takes d6, and knight e6. Very pretty move. Don't count too much the pieces at this point. Just enjoy the attack. Rook c8 was played in the game. King c8, and now rook a7. But please notice, it's very interesting to notice here that this bishop is so strong, and this knight is just terrific. It's really helpful in the attack. What white would like to do next is to bring like Shirov, no, the queen to the attack. They would like to, for example, bring the queen in this way, c2, a4, a5, and give mate on c7 or on d8. And it's not so easy for black to fight against this plan, actually. They played in the game knight b6, trying to create some counterplay, and white played an interesting move here. I think there was more than one path to victory, but what Gareev played was very interesting. He played bishop e5. Why on earth would you play that? Well, he would like to bring the queen to the a file, right? But since they put the knight on b6, it's not so easy to use that square anymore. So he's saying, all right, I will speed up my plan, and these pieces around here, bishop, queen, and rook on f8, g8, h8, they are not participating. So I have every right in the world to give up something. No, indeed, if you take on e5, it's mate immediately. Queen takes, the threat of mate, and if black tries knight a8, yeah, feeble defense, of course, you got it, we will take on a8. Rook takes a8, and we mate them on c7. So bishop e5, very logical move, I would say. Not so much for the sacrifice, but in the sense that we would like to bring the queen closer to the attack by a2, a5. Black played rook a8. You know white's next move, of course, queen a2. In this way, we get ready to take back on a7 also. D takes e5 was played by black. Difficult situation in any case. And queen a5. Interesting, no? Don't count the pieces, please. That's not important here. The important thing is the relative value. White's pieces are just too strong in this position. Black's king is stuck there on the queen side. They played rook takes a7, queen takes b6. We're more interested in the knight, so that we are threatening to give mate and take some black pieces also. Black's only chance at this point, queen takes e6 in order to avoid mate. As you can see, king b8 would not be of any help here. White will play queen c7 and queen d8 and take on c8. So they played queen takes c6, and simply Gareev took back on e6 with check, queen takes c6. You can see that next turn he will take on e5 no matter what black plays, which means that the rook will be attacked on h8, independing of where black's king is. Either black's king will be checked, or there will be the threat of queen b8, so in the end we pick up the other rook. Interestingly enough, even in this final position of the game, black still has a healthy material advantage, but of course they are completely lost here. Something about the relative value of the pieces. I think Gareev gave us a good lesson here in this game. Very nice play. First observation here, please. We have a key defender on a8. That's one of black's few active pieces, so it makes perfect sense to try to trade off that rook. That's our first priority here. Rook a1. You could also say that whenever you're attacking, try to find the best channel for your attack. Try to see which part of the board could be used to develop that attack. You would usually say the e file. Like imagine there were 2 pawns on the a file. Maybe then white should like line up on the e file instead in that case. But here we already have the open a file to work on, so that's the fastest lane towards black's king, you could say. All right, we have arrived at our third and last method within attacking methods 1, and this is what I call opening up lines for the attack. So this can be done on files, and it can be done on diagonals, and on some rare occasion also you could do it on ranks, like 7th rank. You could try to clear the 7th rank for your rook or something like that. But mainly we're talking about opening up files and diagonals. In our first example, we're playing with the black pieces. You can see that it's a Sicilian structure, and black, apparently they have no big problems here. Sorry. What I can see here is that, and you also, that white's pieces are not in very active places. White's minor pieces, they are not perfectly placed exactly, but it's still a solid position for white. What white would like to do here, probably they would like to play knight f3, kick away the bishop on e5, it will go somewhere, and then we will try to push c4. This would be white's dream, to set up some kind of Maroczy structure and slowly try to take over in this Sicilian structure. However, in this game, with the white pieces, Shyam, and playing black, Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa hurried to open up lines towards white's king. Praggnanandhaa is a fantastic attacker, and he sensed that white's king is weak here. You can see that For example, white has played g3, but they don't have a bishop on g2. That's already a bad sign. The bishop would have been much better off on g2. That would be a way for white to safeguard the king. We will actually look at this method later on in the chapter about prophylaxis. I think it's chapter 22 or 23. However, in this case, it's black to play, and so we should hurry up to attack them before bishop f1 becomes possible. So how do you think black could do that? How could we open up some file or diagonal for our attack? Good point. There are two ways to do it. Yeah, exactly. We could play d5. This is a typical Sicilian method. When I was a kid, I was taught that whenever you achieve d5, you're fine in Sicilian. There are some exceptions, of course, but in this case, this would actually help white. White could take on d5, and after bishop takes d5, they would not fall for the temptation to take on g6 and on e5, because in that case, as you can see, black will take with the f pawn, so that the pawn on f2 is threatened. That would be a bad idea. What white would simply do here, they would play bishop e4 in the context of fighting for equality. They would be able to neutralize black. This would be a dream, believe me, compared to what awaits white in the game. So d5, it's possible in the context of equalizing, but if we want to play for more, we should rather play like Pragananda played in the game. And by now, you know, of course, which move I'm thinking about. When we apply this idea of opening files and diagonals, we use the pawns, and in this case, completely correct, f5, that's the right move. Very, very nice move. It has so many advantages. We can just talk about a few of them. One, of course, that it tries to open up the h1, a8 diagonal for the bishop. Two, you could say if the pawn stays, it can advance and it can clear the f file. And you can also say three, if white takes, we take back. We are denying white of this square on e4. Please notice also pawn structure. We don't care about such things anymore. We're attacking here. We don't care about this weak pawn on d7. They won't have a chance to exploit it anyway because we are after their king. So that's good to notice also when you're attacking. You can't be too sensitive about pawn structure and things like that. But you should just go for the attack. So, all right, f5, that's what he played in the game. White took on f5, but the only chance here, it seemed, was to play knight f3. Yeah, not the move that white wanted to play, because now black could continue with the f pawn as we talked about. This is a key plan in the Dutch. Perhaps if you play the Dutch with black, you know that the f4 push is one of the key ideas. Still, white will have a chance to save their skin here. And I was just curious, what do you think would be white's best move here? How could white possibly keep their king somewhat protected? You're right. They can play this ugly move, but it's actually rather strong. g4. In this way, white would, at least for now, keep the black attack at bay. It's ugly to play like this, but it's some kind of blockade which will help us to save our king, safeguard our king in a better way. Maybe we can later on, I don't know, bring the queen a little closer, perhaps. It wouldn't be that easy for black to enter now. So this was probably the last chance for white, to play after f5, knight f3, trying to bring about a blockade. I mean, he saw this move, of course, Shyam, in the game, but he must have disliked f4 and maybe g4. He said this must be bad to weaken my king like that, but this probably was the last chance. Let's see what happened in the game. After f5, white took on f5 and black took back, as we were discussing. This is very nice for black because this square is not available for white anymore. You can already spot a big threat here. Exactly, queen c6 coming next with mating threats. So white, unfortunately, they're not in time here, because if bishop f1, we could quickly play f4, and they don't make it to switch to g2, because now we're also targeting the f2 pawn, right? We're about to take on g3 and attack f2, since also our rook is in the battle. So this would be very, very difficult for white. Bishop e2 is another move I looked at, trying to play bishop f3, but it's the same story here. f4 is very unpleasant for white. So after e takes f5, white played queen f3, sorry, knight f3, and they're again intending to play bishop f1, bishop g2. At the same time, they're also attacking the bishop on e5. But there is a solution here for black, very simple. we can play queen c6. If you thought about f4, then congratulations, that's also a very interesting move. However, there is a difference here. There is always some small difference with every move, right? White could play g4, the move that we talked about before, so that after queen c6 they could go bishop e4. This would be the big difference. Yeah, there are some sacrifices like that, but that's not what we wanted. No, it's a little more complex than necessary. So it's much better what Praggnanandhaa played in the game. He plays here queen c6, while white cannot oppose the battery on the long diagonal. So this is basically already the beginning of the end. White cannot stand this kind of battery. It's just too much. They played in the game king g2, what an ugly move. Self-pinning, but how to defend that knight if bishop e2. This time, since the bishop cannot oppose on the diagonal, you got it, of course. Now we push f4, and it's already too much pressure on white to be able to save this game. As you can see, pawn takes, and at some point we can maybe take. And so after queen c6, king g2, how do you think black can improve their attack? What's coming next? Should we just play f4, or is there something even simpler? You could indeed play f4. I would play bishop e4, definitely, but then you could take on e4 quickly. This time it's even stronger, rook takes, bishop takes, because now we have the pin coming up on f3. So this was possible also. g4 will fail to knight h4. But what he played in the game is so simple. I like his approach more. He just played rook a e8, bringing the last friend to the party. Now we will retreat the bishop, and later on we will exploit the fact that white's queen is overloaded to two defensive functions at the same time. White played rook c2, and after bishop f6, as you can see, we are threatening already. Rook takes e1, deflecting white's queen from the defense of the knight. So white played here rook takes, and at this point, I think black is even, well, I think black's main threat here is knight e5, of course. I was going to say that even rook e1 is in there, but yeah, probably not, because white would take and then run with the king. Oh, but it's hanging on d3 also. Yeah, maybe even rook e1 is coming, but all right, let's not complicate things too much. Knight e5 is the big threat here. White played bishop e2. I think there were more than one way to win here, but what Praggnanandhaa played was very simple. A little tactical trick to finish off white. Rook takes e2. You can find such moves in tactics books. After queen takes e2, of course, knight e5. As you can see, the knight on f3 will fall next turn. You could take it with the queen and win the endgame, but you could also take with the knight. Not here because you get mated, but you could play some preparatory move like h6, and after that you could take with the knight to continue the attack. Very pleasant choice for sure. Both will be winning. So at this point, actually, white resigned. So what we saw here in this example was, I would say, a rather simple approach. Black noticed that they should go for an attack. White's king is weak. The pieces are not in the right places. The bishop is missing on g2 and so on. But we have to act quickly. And important in this sense is to open up the long diagonal, h1, a8 diagonal. We can do that by f5. We don't care about weak pawns on d7 or things like that. We want to attack. This move helps several of our pieces in the attack against white's king. We have arrived at our last example. I wanted to show you something from the IQP structure. That's always interesting in the terms of attacking play. We're playing here with white pieces. It's a strange IQP because, yeah, there are, for starters, a pawn missing on the b file. The bishop is usually not on this side. There is no pawn on e6, and also the knight is usually on f3 in the IQP structure. But anyway, and the pawn is on f4. So many things which are different, but still it has some features of the IQP. So one important thing about the isolated queen's pawn is that the opponent very much likes to block it. With black to play, here an interesting move would have been knight d5. Please notice I'm saying this in the first place. I'm not saying knight takes d4, which is another candidate, but knight d5, that's probably what black would like to play. The bishop on b2, in that case, it would not be in the best possible place. That's usually a bad place, actually, for the bishop in the IQP structure. It prefers very much to be somewhere else, like on g5, for example. However, it's white to play. And they noticed here in this game between playing white Rakhmanov and playing black Faiz Rakhmanov. Rakhmanov noticed that time is money. We have to open up the game for an attack before they plug the d pawn by knight e5. And he didn't shy away from giving away a pawn. In the previous example, Praggnanandhaa didn't sacrifice anything. until the very end. We will actually see him in the next chapter, but he will indeed sacrifice something. But in the previous example, he didn't sacrifice anything. He didn't need to. But here, okay, in the very end, rook takes e2. I admit that was a sacrifice. But here, in any case, white needs to act quickly. So it's okay to give up a pawn. We have a very nice bishop pair lined up against black's king. So it's definitely justified to sacrifice. But of course, before doing that, we need to calculate a little also. You know which move I'm talking about. Of course, I'm talking about the move d5. But before we play it, we have to make sure that we have an answer both to queen takes d5 and knight takes d5. By the way, this knight on f6, it would be great to trade it off by knight h5. This would be another such aggressive exchange, trading off the defender. But in this case, black would have no reason to take. If they take, knight takes, queen takes, g6, white will play something like queen h6, and they will have some chances of pushing d5 with mating threats and so on, or perhaps push the f pawn. However, if knight h5, what do you think black would play? Aha, no reason to cooperate here. Black would play knight e5 instead, safely blocking the pawn on d4. So this would not be ideal for white. Of course, they can try to attack anyway, but they would be missing the bishop on b2, right, in the battle. So that explains white's choice in this game, but we really have to figure out how the variations go. So let's just make a small experiment here. Let's think that we actually play d5. Okay, black can take in two different ways. Let's start with knight takes d5. What do you think? How would you continue in that case? Is there any sacrifice that comes to mind? We have the two bishops lined up. Black has few defenders around their king. Aha, maybe you remember those famous double bishop sacrifices which were used back in Lasker's time, perhaps. Blackburn, was he the one using this? Zuckertorte, I don't really remember, but it was back in those days, like 130 years ago, they would do these things. So you're right, if they take with a knight, we can look into that double sacrifice on h7 and g7, because we have plenty of pieces in the attack. The queen would reach h5 and the knight could reach f5 also very soon. On the other hand, after d5, they could also take with the queen. No, we don't want to trade queens here. That would be the end to our attack. Fortunately, after d5, queen takes d5, you can see that we can damage black's pawn structure, right? Aha, we can take on f6, which means that they will have to take back. They don't have time to take our bishop. That would be great to trade queens, but then we win the exchange, and we will have a technically better position though, because we have the extra exchange, and it's a friendly position for the side with the rook, so to speak. Not the kind of position where the side which sacrificed exchange has like a blockade or a protected square for the knight. This is a different kind of position. So going back to this, okay, we will just check the last part. d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes. They would have to take back on f6. And at this point, you can already smell that there must be something on the king side now, either on h7 or on g7. But okay, I won't torture you with this calculation. Let's see what happened in the game. They played e5 here, Rachmanov. That's what he played. If knight takes, as we were discussing, the double sacrifice would be very powerful. Oh, that's actually the game. Oh, I see. That's how the game went. Bishop takes, king takes, queen h5. So he carried out the sacrifice. Yeah, definitely he knew it's a 2600 player. But I mean, he had to figure out that it actually works. Bishop takes d7. You can see threat of mating 1. Black has to take back. If you play something like f5, it's well intended to give the king a square, but white has queen h8 and take on f8. As simple as that, because they can later on pick up the queen if black takes back. So after bishop takes g7, black will have to take back on g7. We talked about this before, some benefits with having the knight on on g3, sorry, it can go to f5. In other circumstances, we would try to go for some kind of rook lift to the h-file, but it's not necessary here because we can bring in the knight. You can see that the king cannot go up because there is mate. It can also not go down because then there is also mate on g7, right? So Faiz Rachmanov had to give back material. Queen takes f5. White took back. At this point, we have a material advantage for white. A slight material advantage, but yeah, 3 pieces versus queen. This is the kind of situation that the queen really likes. We saw some other examples, if you remember Lalic Hulak, where Hulak could have arranged this kind of material relation, but in a much more closed position, which meant that the queen was not so powerful. But now she's extremely powerful. So what white needs is simply the assistance of one more piece to attack black's king. So that can happen very soon if we somehow manage to bring in a rook by d1, d3, g3, and so on. In the game, black played rook d6. white played queen g5 check first, so that the king goes to the h file, and also we don't let them play rook g6 because then we can take on d5. So black played king h7, and now white played rook cd1. Simple as that. We attack the knight, and also we get ready to swing over the rook to the h file. Black played f5, and white found a little tactical trick here. What do you think? How could we finish off black? Any mating picture on the g and h file, perhaps? That's correct. We can actually sack one of our rooks and use the other one to mate black. Rook takes d5, and after rook takes d5, rook e6, black resigned because there is no good way of defending against the threat of mate. The check on d1, we can just go up, and if they check us again, we can attack the rook and so on. So that's what happened in the game after the move d5. Of course, now we need to also talk briefly about what would happen then if they take with the queen. So I'm convinced that what Rachmanov noticed here was exactly that what we talked about. Bishop takes f6. If queen takes, that's what we were discussing, bishop takes d8, and this kind of position, let's say, they take back on d8. They take on d1 first, perhaps. Yeah, this is not nice for black. Rook takes, and they will have to take with the knight, I think. Yeah, no matter how they play here, you can say it's a nightmare to play this with black because there are open files for the rooks, so something like rook c7 should be very favorable for white. Not the kind of endgame you want with a minus exchange. So after queen takes d5, bishop takes f6, they will have to take back on f6, and at this point, we talked about this, we can try to range an attack either against h7 or g7. One way to continue here, I use this as an exercise. It's interesting because you have so many options, but the best course of action here would be to give check on g4 first, and after king h8, at this moment we should focus on the g7 square. How can we do that? Well, there is a little tactical trick that we have to be careful about. If we play something like knight f5, there is rook g8, protecting the g7 square and preparing a counterattack. And if you play something flashy like bishop takes h7, hoping to mate black here after king takes knight f5, rook g8, queen h5, something like that. Actually, black has a very nice resource here. What do you think? This one could have appeared in the chapter about tricks. Black has a little trick here. You got it. Queen takes g2. Very pretty, because in this way, after king takes knight e5, black gets back the material, and they can definitely fight in this endgame. So back to business here after queen takes d7, bishop, queen takes d5, bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, queen g4, king h8. White's best move here. Not easy to establish, but I'm convinced that Rachmanov, he saw this queen h4. That's a very precise move. We're hitting the pawn, threat of mating 1. There are no tricks with queen g2, because after king takes g2, the knight cannot attack white's queen. Black will take on d3, but as you can see now, we will focus on the g7 square instead. We will play here queen takes f6, and our next move, of course, what do you think? We have two choices. Try to establish the difference, please. Aha, not very difficult. We can help the queen in two ways. We can go here and there, but simple logics dictate that it must be better to go to f5, because then we have an extra possibility. Now, knight f5 also threatens knight h6. So if you go this way, I will of course play queen g6. Oh, you will also say that I can play queen d4. Yeah, that's true. Both are fine here, but not so if we play knight f5. In this way, we prevent queen d4, and also we get ready to mate black here. So this would be a disaster for black. So final word here. White calculated, of course, but they felt that something's going on here. I think it's something about this knight, honestly. I think it's when I play white in the Nimzo Indian, for example, sometimes my knight arrives here also on g3. It ends up on g3. It can be very powerful in some attacking situations. Maybe because we're used to having it on f3. But here it definitely boosts white's attack after d5. We can use it, for example, after queen takes, when we double their pawns. Later on, it has an enticing destiny on f5. So d5, that's what white played in this game, and he had different attacking ideas at his disposal. It was just a question of using them in the right way. Please don't forget the little trick used in the game. Bishop takes after knight d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes, and queen h5, and then bishop takes g7. Very pretty execution of the attack. All right, we have seen three important methods. We started with mobilization to the attack. We saw Shirov's very nice game, brought the queen to f3 with devastating effect. We saw Rachmanidis performing a similar idea with the bishop coming to f6, working on the dark squares, where there were no opposing bishop in black's camp for the moment. We saw Van Forest bringing the knight to the kingside by knight f1, and later on there was a plan with bishop f4 and knight g3, where it caused a lot of problems for black's king. We saw Dubov using a typical rook maneuver, rook lift, you could say, rook b1, rook e1, and later on he brought the rook to the kingside, to the g file specifically, because our main target here was the pawn on g7. Then we switched topic to aggressive exchanges, trading off the defender. We saw how Arjan used this typical bishops trading off the bishops. You could say also strategical. In general, it's a good trade, but here for tactical reasons, for attacking reasons, I would say, it's a very important idea. So knight f3, that's what Arjan played, preparing to go bishop g5, and after that, he also brought the queen to the attack, and black had big problems. We saw in Gareyev's example that we can also trade off a rook in order to help our attack. Rook a1 was very powerful because this was the easiest place on the board where we could enter to attack black's king. We saw in Praggnanandha's example, we switched to the other topic here about opening up lines for the attack. We saw that f5 had several benefits, the most important ones being opening up the h1, a8 diagonal for our attack, and also on some occasions the f-file would be cleared for attacking purposes. It was also nice for us that after e takes, we were happy that they could not use this square on e4 to trade off our strong bishop on b7. And finally we saw Rachmanov using a similar idea with a d5 push, a typical idea in the IQP structure. Here it was almost terminal. It led to a winning advantage because black could not safeguard their king. Specifically, there was the idea of bishop takes f6, tearing up their kingside, and also we saw the idea of if knight takes, the double sacrifice on h7 and g7. White had so many pieces in the attack, but it was important to play this move d5 before black got a chance to block it with knight d5. That would have been a game changer for sure. So d5, very important move on the topic of opening up lines for the attack. All right, thanks a lot and see you in the next chapter.